The fall of the USSR in 1991 gave Ukraine its independence as a sovereign country. It was one of the most 10 advanced countries in Europe. It had been 20% of the Russian production, of the Russian market forces, of the Russian manufacturing. It was a powerhouse. But what happened? Is it still really the independent country it once was? Did it lose more than the protection of the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991?
Good evening, and Merry Christmas to all Americans across our great country. During these last few months, you and I have witnessed one of the greatest dramas of the 20th century, the historic and revolutionary transformation of a totalitarian dictatorship, the Soviet Union, and the liberation of its peoples. As we celebrate Christmas, this day of peace and hope, I thought we should take just a few minutes to reflect on what these events mean for us as Americans.
The Ukraine-Russia story is complicated. It's not clear-cut. Everybody's had a little bit of Ukraine over the last 1,000 years. The Golden Horde, the Lithuanian Empire, the Hungarian Empire, the Kingdom of Poland, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and finally the Russian Empire. It's not been an easy journey for Ukraine, and yet when it became part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, it became really quite Russian. Responsible for over 20% of Soviet output, Ukraine was a breadbasket of the country. It was the heavy industry master. It produced trains, it produced ships. It was able to produce aircraft carriers, one of the few countries in the world that could do so. It had a space industry, it had an aircraft industry. This was a country that was ripe to be on the up once it became independent. But what's happened? Since independence, the Ukrainian economy has shrunk by a third. What the once proud manufacturer of many, many products is now buying them from out with its own borders. It's got no shipping industry anymore. It's got no rocket industry. It's got no aircraft industry. It can't even make cars for itself. A former shadow of where it was. What happened to Ukraine? Well, it became friends with Europe and America. That's what happened to Ukraine. But how can that be a disadvantaged situation? Because obviously before everything went into Russia, and it wasn't really paid for it as such, it was just part of the Russian economy and it was all kept within its own borders. Yes, it was, but everybody was working to the same end. The money was ploughed in to build up the country. The money was ploughed in to help the people and to improve their standard of living. And after it became independent, then the vultures saw it as an opportunity, because a country with that level of sophistication and that level of production, they didn't want it to be able to compete with European companies. They didn't want it to be able to compete with American companies. So they made the entry to the market very difficult for it. In fact, they made the entry to the market so bad that it couldn't really go there. We had very nationalist leaders of Ukraine who were siding with America because they were supporting it, because obviously they like to stir. Because anything close to Russia that can get under the Russian skin, they like to poke away at the bear. And that's what they kept doing, and they would feed Ukraine. And the US did what it did to Russia in 1990. Made it easy for them to buy stuff, but harder for them to sell stuff. And then we had things like the coal scam. So Ukraine was really well off for coal, but it wasn't developed, and nobody really wanted to develop it. So Ukraine had to buy coal, and it could buy coal cheaply from Russia, but politically it didn't want to do that because it wanted to be seen as independent. So it would go and buy coal from Pennsylvania and from South Africa. Now imagine you have to ship the coal from halfway around the world to get it into Ukraine, when there are someone on your doorstep who could have either helped you mine your own coal or sold you their own cheap coal. But no, Ukraine had to be seen to be independent, and the same with gas.
In the reverse mode, through the special schemes, the same gas is purchased from Gazprom's supplies to the EU, but through European intermediaries, for example, through Poland. As a result, Over 4 years, the price of gas for the population increased by 1,079%.
The nationalist presidents of Ukraine in the early 2000s stirred up a lot of anti-Russian feeling, mainly at the behest of America and the way that they wanted to move away from America and look towards their European neighbours to become more European, to become more independent. And it was all a political move just to sever the ties with the USSR, the former USSR, and to sever the ties with Russia. And then you get people who make investments in your country, people like George Soros, who's made investments in many, many countries. And most of them all turn out to end up in some kind of overthrow of government or war. You've heard of the colour revolutions, you've heard of Syria, Libya, you've heard of Iraq, the Arab Spring, Iran, and of course the Maidan in 2014. The timeline of Ukraine's leadership since independence in 1991. So Kravchuk, leader of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, declares independence from Moscow. In a referendum and presidential election, Ukrainians approve his independence and elect him as president. 1994, Kravchuk loses the presidential election to Kuchma, also a former communist, and elections deemed largely free and fair by observers. So far so good. 1999, Kuchma is re-elected in a vote riddled with irregularities. Now this might start to seed the pattern of what's going to happen in Ukraine. 2004, pro-Russian candidate Yanukovych is declared president, but allegations of vote rigging, protests and what become known as the Orange Revolution force a rerun of the vote. A pro-Western former Prime Minister Yushchenko is elected president. 2005, Yushchenko takes power with promises to lead Ukraine out of the Kremlin's orbit towards NATO and the European Union. He appoints former energy company boss Yulia Tymoshenko as Prime Minister, but after infighting in Ukraine's pro-Western camp, she is sacked. 2008, NATO promises Ukraine it will one day join the alliance. 2010, Yanukovych defeats Tymoshenko in a presidential election. Russia and Ukraine clinch a gas pricing deal in exchange for the extension of the lease for the Russian Navy in a Ukrainian Black Sea port, Sevastopol. 2013, Yanukovych's government suspends trade and association talks with the EU in November and opts to revive economic ties with Moscow. Oh my God. This triggers months of mass rallies in Kiev and protest. 2014, the protests, largely focused around Kiev's Maidan Square, turn violent. Dozens of protesters are killed. In February, Parliament votes to remove Yanukovych, who flees. Within days, armed men seize the parliament of the Ukrainian region of Crimea and raise the Russian flag. Moscow annexes the territory after a March 16th referendum which shows overwhelming support in Crimea for joining the Russian Federation. In April, pro-Russian separatists in the eastern region of Donbass declare independence. Fighting breaks out and has continued sporadically ever since, despite frequent ceasefires into 2022. In May, businessman Poroshenko wins a presidential election with a pro-Western agenda. And then a law was passed by Ukraine that exonerated anyone that had been involved in the protests from being persecuted or prosecuted.
We are imposing sanctions on specific individuals responsible for undermining the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and government of Ukraine.
So the whole situation came about because Obama decided that he was going to enable Ukraine to be more independent and less reliant on Russia and to steal them away from Russia. But the government was kind of leaning towards Russia, so Obama gave them money, set up deals, and sent in his best men to deal with it. He sent in his vice president, Joe Biden.
The office of the General Prosecutor desperately needs reform. The judiciary should be overhauled. The energy sector needs to be competitive, ruled by market principles, not sweetheart deals. Ukraine needs a budget that's consistent with your IMF commitments. Anything else will jeopardize Ukraine's hard-won progress and drive down the support for Ukraine from the international community, which is always tenuous. The whole world is watching you. That's a fact. They're watching you because their hopes for your success.
He sent in his Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton.
I just wanted to have a chance to publicly say thank you. I think Hillary will go down as one of the finest Secretaries of States we've had.
And you can see that Hillary Clinton set up a number of NGOs that were working with tech companies to sculpt the narrative.
What we've done with Secretary Clinton's Civil Society 2.0 program is we've taken one of America's undeniable strengths, the strength of our technology and of our innovators, and we've put them to work in service of our diplomatic goals.
They drove down Russian influence. They upped the nationalism. And as part of that, the disturbing previous elements of Ukraine that had shared things with the Nazi Party came more and more to the fore. And we've seen the use of symbols, the use of salutes, the use of insignia, and the use, and these people are quite open about how they support the far right. So after Maidan and Poroshenko was installed, it was effectively a coup. 2017, an association agreement between Ukraine and the EU is passed, opening markets for free trade of goods and services and visa-free travel to the EU for Ukrainians. 2019, a new Ukrainian Orthodox Church wins formal recognition, angering the Kremlin. Ukraine was formerly pretty much Russian Orthodox Church. Former actor and comedian Vladimir Zelensky defeats Poroshenko in an April presidential election, promising to tackle corruption and end the simmering conflict in eastern Ukraine. His Servant of the People party wins a July parliamentary election.
President Zelensky, have you felt any pressure from President Trump to investigate Joe Biden and Hunter Biden?
I think you read everything. So I think you read text. I'm sorry, but I don't want to be involved to democratic, open elections of USA.
Then his rival in the US presidential race, and Biden's son, Hunter Biden, over possible business dealings in Ukraine.
However, there were brave people who decided to invest in Ukrainian oil. The attention of world media is attracted by one company, Burisma Holdings. There are very, very interesting people on the board of directors of Burisma. For example, Hunter Biden is the son of the Vice President of the United States. Of course, this state of affairs is welcome, but one detail interferes. The son of the U.S. Vice President received his post almost immediately after the official visit of his father to Ukraine, in the light of obvious interest of Biden Sr. in everything that is happening in Ukraine.
June 2020, International Monetary Fund approves a $5 billion lifeline to help Ukraine starve off default during a pandemic-induced recession. January 2021, Zelensky appeals to Biden, who is now US President, for Ukraine to join NATO. February 2021, Zelensky's government imposes sanctions on Viktor Medvedchuk, an opposition leader and the Kremlin's most prominent ally in Ukraine, and the most person likely to beat Zelensky in any kind of election. Spring 2021, Russia masses troops near Ukraine's borders. They are partly dispersed after what Russia says was a training exercise. October 2021, Ukraine uses a Turkish TB2 drone for the first time in eastern Ukraine, angering Russia. Now remember, Ukraine has been at war effectively with Donbass since 2014. Autumn 2021, Russia again begins massing troops near Ukraine. December 2021, Biden warns Russia of sweeping Western economic sanctions if it invades Ukraine. December 17th, 2021, Russia presents detailed security demands, including a legally binding guarantee that NATO will give up any military activity in Eastern Europe and Ukraine.
As anybody in the world, the citizen that the United States is going to use this Ukraine thing at any moment to push towards a hot war.
And then in December it steps up. Ukraine starts to shell Donbass more than it had before. Twice as much, 3 times as much, 4 times as much. January, 10 times as much, 20 times as much. And then in February, we know what happens then. This is what it's come to from 1991. From the moment of independence, America and Europe have been trying to get Ukraine, and they got it. And they've provoked Russia into making the step. This has been the goal since 1991. Ukraine was courted by the USA, by Europe. They wanted it to become one of their biggest customers, not their suppliers. So Ukraine became a net importer of almost everything that it used to export. It was deindustrialised. It became a shadow of its former self. It was encouraged to become nationalist. Loans were arranged. Loans. That puts it in debt to the IMF, to the US, to the EU. It was promised the possibility of joining NATO. Obama was their friend. He sent his friends in to help them. He sent in Clinton. He sent in Biden. He helped them pick the right government. And when they picked the wrong government, George Soros was there to help them, to make them change over to a more West-friendly government. Sanctions were imposed on Russia. It was the big bad. Ukraine was the place to be. Happens now. America has its proxy war. It's now fighting via Ukraine. It's fighting Russia, the big bad. But just maybe it's bitten off more than it can chew. How's it going to extract itself from this now? What happens next? That's the big question. And we'll dig into that in the next episode. Thank you. Like, share and subscribe, please.
Cause I don't give a fuck what you say. Yeah, I'ma do shit my way. So you can go kick rocks, I'ma stack bricks up, build what I want to make. Yo, I got a lot of shit to say, so I'ma do this every day. I'll be writing things until I'm fucking buried in my grave.